If you've ever wanted to adjust the neckline of a sweater pattern that includes a shaped neck, but you didn't understand how to go about it, this week's Technique Tuesday will take the mystery out of how shaped necklines are planned and calculated. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen and use the chapter titles to guide you to the starting point of the desired section. Use the gear icon to slow down or speed up playback. Shaped necklines are used in sweaters with seamed shoulders, such as drop shoulder, modified drop shoulder, and set-in sleeve sweaters. They're also used in some raglan sweaters, but other types of raglans and circular yoke sweaters do not have shaped necks. This is a schematic, which is a line drawing representation of a sweater that has a crew neck. The dimensions of the neck opening are shown here. This one is 6.5 inches wide and this is 3 inches deep. This is a quarter scale version of that sweater. This sweater actually has some ribbing knit in. So the dimensions that were shown on that schematic were the dimensions of the opening before the ribbing was knit. The way a crew neck is designed is that the neck opening across the back of the neck is about half of the total width between the two shoulders. It can vary from a sweater to sweater, but in general, the opening for a crew neck is about half the width of that shoulder width. That is wider than the actual width of the neck, and so when the ribbing is knit, it fills in some of that space up to the neck, and so it creates a close-fitting neck once it's finished. But the ribbing itself is just filling in some of that opening that was created when the body was knit. As I mentioned, the width of the back of the neck is about half of the distance between the two shoulders. The width of the base of the front of the neck is about half of the width of the back of the neck. The rest of the width is gained through shaping. So if you're working bottom up, you'd be working in this direction. These would be bound off, and then you'd be working decreases on each side of the neck in pairs, one on each side of the neck, until you had the full width that you needed. And then typically there's about a half an inch to a full inch of vertical plain knitting going straight up to the neckline. So in general, that is how this type of neck is shaped. But the specific stitch counts and row counts that you're going to use is going to depend on the type of yarn you're using and what stitch gauge and row gauge that yarn is worked with. So let's say we're working with a worsted weight yarn, and our gauge is 5 stitches and 7 rows per inch. That's pretty typical for worsted weight. So if our neckline is 6.5 inches wide, that would be 32.5 stitches, because 6.5 inches times 5 stitches per inch is 32.5 stitches. Obviously, we cannot make a neck that is 32.5 stitches wide. So we're going to round down to 32 stitches. So that's how wide the back of our neck is going to be. The next thing we need to look at is how deep our neck is. It's going to be 3 inches deep. So we have 3 inches deep times 7 rows per inch is equal to 21 rows. So the total number of rows we're going to be working for this neck is 21. Since we have 32 stitches and half of the stitches are going to be forming at the base, that means the front base of the neck is equal to 16 stitches. That means we have to eliminate 16 more stitches to get the neck as wide as it needs to be. So half of them, 8 of them, are going to be on this side, and 8 of them are going to be decreased on this side. Since we're going to always decrease them on the same row, we're going to be doing 2 at one time, but we only want to do it on right side rows. But they're going to be 8 decrease rows in order to eliminate the 8 stitches over here and the 8 stitches over here. So we have 8 decrease rows. And we have 21 rows in total. We also know that we need a little bit of straight vertical right here, about 1/2 inch to a full inch. So let's see how that actually lays out, because we can just sort of diagram it out. So if we are working bottom up, we are going to be binding off at the base of the neckline. So that's going to be one row that we're going to get rid of those 16 stitches. And then we need to work a wrong side row before we can work any decrease rows. We know we have that there. We know we have each of these 8 decrease rows that we have to work. So those are each one row long. And we know that after our final decrease, we need somewhere between 4 and 7 rows. If we have 7 rows per inch, 1/2 inch would be 3.5, which obviously we can't work. So 4 rows to 7 rows we need to work after our final decrease row to have that vertical edge there. So I'm going to put 4 there. So these are all absolutely taken. We have to work those rows. So how many does this add up to? Well, it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We've got 14 rows taken up, and we need 21 altogether. So we need to add 7 more rows. That means we can add 1 wrong side row after each of these first 7 decrease rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that will give us exactly 21 rows. So that worked out perfectly in this example. Another way to visualize how the neckline is going to be worked is to draw it out using graph paper. I have drawn this out using Knitter's graph paper. You can get this free printable graph paper online. I'll leave some links in the description. But it gives you an idea proportionally how this neckline is going to look. More so than if you were to use regular graph paper that had square holes, because knitted stitches do tend to be wider than they are deep. If you have a situation where you are able to get all of your decrease rows in with a plain round after them, but you end up having too many plain rounds at the end. Maybe your neckline is deeper than this, quite a bit deeper, and you end up with more than 1 inch's worth of stitches back here. You can distribute some of those stitches between some of the decrease rows instead. So you'd want to distribute them in pairs. If you needed to remove some of the plain rounds that you had at the end, you could put a pair of additional plain rounds between decrease 7 and 8, giving you 3 plain rounds, so a wrong side row and then a right side row and wrong side row again, so that your decrease would again be on a right side row. So you'd add them in pairs and removing them off the end to distribute them out until you had everything balanced out well enough. You want to create the extra rows closer to the shoulder rather than closer to the base. But sometimes the situation is different. You end up having a wider neck, but it's just the same depth. So let's say we had a 3-inch deep neckline like we talked about before, but in this case, the neck was 8 inches wide at 5 stitches per inch. So we needed 40 stitches all the way around. We wouldn't have enough rows in order to distribute all of those single decreases all the way up and then still give ourselves some vertical edge at the end. So what you can do instead of binding off half of the stitches in one go, instead you can bind off 1/3 of the stitches, and then you take another 1/3, split them up onto each side, and then have a couple of smaller bind off rows. So 14 stitches is about 1/3 of 40. And then the next 14 stitches you would divide, so 7 on this side and 7 on this side, and you create 2 bind off rows for each of those. And so this just makes It makes the very base narrower than if you had bound off half the stitches, but you're kind of continuing that base spreading out before you start angling up. And that can work as well. So if you're in this kind of a situation where you want to do this, you have your initial bind off row, which is the right side row at the center. And then on your wrong side row, on this side, you have a bind off going in that direction. On this side, it's on the next right side row that you're going to have a bind off in that direction. So you're binding off every row for a while, but only on one side where you're doing the bind offs. And then once you're ready to do your decreases, you're doing them on right side rows. So you can add all of those bind off rows up. There's a single row and that plain wrong side row. Then you have all of your decrease rows. So you add those up, 1, 2, 3, 11, 12, and now you can still add your plain rounds 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and that still leaves you 4 plain rounds after this final decrease round in order to get to your 21. So there are a couple of ways to distribute those stitches depending on the proportion of how wide your neck is versus how deep it is. So if you are designing a crew neck from scratch, you're designing your own sweater, you might need to play a little bit with the width and depth of your neckline in order for it to fit within your stitch patterns. So in my sweater here, I have all of these different panels of complex cables, and I wanted the neckline to hit at a specific point in this cable repeat. And so I wanted it to start right after this point in the cable, but I also wanted to fit it entirely within panels of other stitch patterns so I wasn't breaking into them. So for this neck, I ended up making that opening only 2.5 inches deep, but I made it something like 7.5 inches wide. So it still gives me the same amount of room in the opening because that opening has to fit over my head, which is larger than my neck, but I could play with the width and the depth a little bit in order to make that happen. If you are wanting to knit a sweater from a published pattern and you're not really convinced that that neckline is a size that you want, you can check the schematic and see how wide the neck is going to be. Then take a tape measure and measure out that distance. And then on your own body, check to see how that is going to center. Where is that opening going to hit you on your shoulders? And then when you read the instructions for how deep the ribbing is supposed to be, you can get an idea of how much closer to the neck that's going to be. You may decide you want something wider, you want something narrower, and you may want to adjust it. You may want something that's deeper or shallower than what's in the pattern as well. So you can use those dimensions and then look at them on your own body to see if that's something that you want. If you're designing something yourself or if you're wanting to modify something from a published pattern, you can also look at clothes in your own wardrobe that you like the neckline. So try them on, see where they're hitting you on your neck, measure those openings, and then also how deep the ribbing is. So you need to know how big the opening is and then also how deep the ribbing is so that you will know how that's going to fit on your own body, and then you can design that accordingly. If you'd like to learn more about the basic concepts behind how sweaters are designed and constructed, this series on basic sweater styles may be of interest to you. This video over here can help rectify problems with necks that are too stretchy and sliding down your arms. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.